This is the Lunch and Learn series that the Sierra Fund puts on once a week. And my name is Greg Thrush, and I am a community organizer with the Sierra Fund. Today I want to talk about the secondary impacts of wildfires on our communities, namely the health impacts of smoke, and how the Sierra Fund, in conjunction with a broad coalition of concerned community experts and stakeholders, is thinking about how to mitigate its impacts. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Sierra Fund and their work, but the Sierra Fund's work is to confront the legacy of impacts from the 19th century gold rush that persists to this day in our region, with implications for all of California, as we are the headwaters of our great state. And as we begin to understand how the region's past impacts us today, the question is what needs to be done and how do we do it, as many people and organizations in this area are doing. The Sierra Fund is committed to restore ecosystem and community resiliency with an eye towards how this resiliency can be promoted and protected into the future. And central to the Sierra Fund's mission is a commitment to social and environmental justice. This means that we make efforts to understand what are the issues and needs of as many people as possible and try to address them. So at the Sierra Fund, we use a single strategy to unite our programmatic work. And this little graph here is what we call our theory of change. And it pivots on two axes: investment and resiliency, with an understanding that as you increased investment in the Sierra Nevada region, whether that's monetarily, intellectually, capacity-wise, or some other way, you increase resiliency, or the ability of the region to respond and adapt to change at both the ecosystem level and at the community level. And during our environmental community health summit in 2008, we launched a community health survey, which gave us an opportunity to understand some of our community's priorities. And during the discussion, people pointed to fire as their top issue. And we realized that while many groups and individuals are mobilizing around landscape treatments and forest health, there wasn't much attention being given to the health impacts of fire. So as you can see in this chart, we start with a 360-degree understanding, try to understand the progress, and this is what we will talk about today, kind of our scoping process. We try to engage problem solvers. There are many amazing organizations and individuals our area, doing incredible work around wildfire, and as well as public health officials and community organizations that are working with the populations that live in this area. And then we explore solutions, and by initiating this process, we have the motto, know better, do better. And we took what we were learning and began to engage experts and community members to learn about how to protect public health from wildfire smoke strategically and equitably, with an eye towards vulnerable populations. So as we all know the history of this area pretty well, legacy forest management impact started with the gold rush. Forests were clear-cut to build the towns, timber the mines, and provide fuel. And gold mining as an economic motor in our area was eventually eclipsed by logging, which ushered in forest management strategies and the use of fire suppression to help maintain saleable stands of trees. So, here we are now in the 21st century, and climate change and patterns of housing development in the Sierra foothills, which began in the 1960s, have combined with inadequate forest management to create the situation that we're in today. And forest fires are becoming an existential threat to rural communities and the wildland-urban interfaces like the Sierra Nevadan communities we live in. And while the possibility of a local conflagration is very real, the regional fires that don't directly touch our immediate area are also impact us in significant ways. And the Sierra Fund is making efforts to advance thinking about air quality in Nevada, Yuba, and Sierra counties. So just to take an example in Nevada County for a moment, it sits squarely in a high severity risk area for wildfire, as does most of the Sierra Nevada foothills. As you guys people on this call probably recall the 2008 California wildfire season. It was pretty amazing. It was one of the most devastating since the turn of the 21st century. There were a little more than 4,900 fires that season. 96 of them were greater than 1,000 acres. So, substantially large wildfires. Interestingly, none of these occurred in Nevada County. Yet, the air quality of our region exceeded the 2006 National Particulate Matter 2.5 matter standard, 98th percentile, which is just a standard for poor air quality. Nevada County met that metric 65 days that summer. If you can remember, we experienced prolonged unhealthy air conditions resulting from fires that were somewhere else. So my point being, fire doesn't have to happen directly in our communities to affect us. And when large fires happen, we're finding, this is more broadly statewide, hospitals and health providers do see surge in respiratory related cases. And researchers have begun to study the relationship between health outcomes and smoke from wildfires. And there's a growing understanding that smoke resulting from wildfires is becoming an important public health issue. So when wildfires happen, hospitals and health providers see a surge in respiratory cases, as I mentioned. And so there's a new understanding that smoke resulting from wildfires is important, and that there's a need to address the impacts of smoke and develop strategies to respond to it. So why does particulate matter matter? Well, as I said, there's a growing body of epidemiologic evidence that links exposure to wildfire smoke to elevated risk for adverse pulmonary outcomes. And during wildfire events, there's an uptick in the number of prescribed inhalers for asthma and increasing emergency room visits from heart attack and stroke. And fine particulate matter due to fire emissions is predicted to increase from 150 to 170% in the Western United States by the year 2050. Northern California is one of 3 major regions that will be impacted by an uptick in particulate matter 2.5. And in this context, the residents of Nevada County and the greater Sierra Headwater region are likely to be increasingly subjected to really a dual exposure, both ozone that we get mostly from the Central Valley, and fine particulate matter via wildfire smoke. And so, wildfire smoke, smoke from wildfire impacts public health. It's pretty obvious. And the Sierra Fund began to think about how to address this issue. So the question we posed was, is there a way to respond to poor air quality on a community level? And as we started looking at proposed solutions in other places, the concept of a cleaner airspace emerged as a possible model. And the Sierra Fund imagined a pilot project focused on the Grass Valley, Nevada City area to explore this idea of cleaner air spaces. So a cleaner airspace is really just defined as a building that is publicly accessible with tight ceiling windows and doors and a ventilation system able to significantly reduce the intake of outdoor air by using a central air filtration system that is at least medium or high efficiency. And, it could also be private buildings, but just generally we were interested in thinking about that. So we went on a community discovery process in September of 2019. The Sierra Fund initiated a community discovery process. And as we began to scope this work, we identified a broad set of experts to explore the topic of wildfire, its effects on air quality, and how to mitigate health impacts. We invited stakeholders from education, seniors, children, community services, and air quality monitoring experts to openly discuss the opportunities and barriers for preventing exposure during smoke events. One of the topics that we discussed was whether, when, and how cleaner air spaces could be used to provide vulnerable members of the community some respite from poor air conditions. And then after that, we subsequently conducted some scoping surveys with facilities managers of buildings, and we did interviews with community service providers to identify data gaps and best practices to inform develop what we're calling a cleaner air strategy. It was an opportunity to brainstorm some gathering places in the community and to begin to talk with building managers and get an idea of the constraints and opportunities that they face in dealing with the air quality. We are in the process of writing up our findings, and we've got a draft document that is about to be circulated to public health leaders in the community and service providers and with various areas of expertise to get their feedback. And then we continue to plan this environmentally healthy communities pilot project to continue this work, and if and when we have buy-in from the community leaders to do so. So I just want to kind of quickly go through a few aspects of what this scoping process looked like. Like I said, we did some facility surveys. We tried to understand the census of populations in our area, and we did a discussion, and I'll go into a little discussion of what public air shelters might look like in our area. And so I also want to share some findings. They're preliminary, but I just want to dive into these three areas today a little bit. So one component of this process was the facility survey. And the survey asked about whether buildings were used differently during poor air quality events. It asked about buildings' HVAC capabilities to provide cleaner air environments. It asked about plans to upgrade HVAC systems. It asked about the ability to monitor air quality. Like I said, it was an opportunity to develop some connections with the people that take care of the buildings in our area, and also just to kind of brainstorm what places exist in our community that could be used as public clean air spaces. And so a couple things you can kind of get from this slide is just a sense of the building types that we were able to survey. I list, it was me who did this. I identified about 120 buildings in Nevada County, the kind of greater metropolitan Grass Valley, Nevada City area, and about 50 responded. This gives you a sense of the kinds of buildings that were part of the response. It also shows you that generally there's no real way to monitor the interior quality of air in most buildings. The next thing we did was talk to community service providers about populations they served and air quality. And from this, we identified some specific vulnerable populations. So who's vulnerable? What does it mean? One of the groups is children. Their lungs are still developing, and they tend to spend more time outside, engage in more vigorous activity, inhale more air per pound of body weight. And research shows that a higher rate of asthma admissions for children during and after wildfires. So, potential stakeholders for these are, the schools, childcare centers, childcare providers, after-school programs, all the places where kids congregate. And so they are one very important community, that we are interested in thinking about when we think about this work. Another one is older adults. Older adults have higher rates of pre-existing conditions, lung and heart diseases that make them vulnerable to smoke exposure. Epidemiologic studies of short-term exposures to fine particles have often reported a greater risk of health effects, including hospital admissions and premature mortality in older adults. The stakeholders there, we have Gold Country Services. We have a number of senior living facilities in our area. We, as a county, are an older community on average. And so our senior community is extremely important to us. So we are trying to reach out to those people and get their input on our scoping process. Pregnant women are another group. Physiologic changes during pregnancy, including increases in blood and plasma volumes and increased respiratory rates, increased exposure potential, which is kind of a no-brainer. And then individuals with pre-existing conditions, levels of pollutants that may not affect healthy people can cause breathing difficulties for people with asthma or COPD or other chronic lung diseases. The last group I want to talk about is really more of a phenomena, is just socioeconomic status. It is an indicator of health. Oftentimes, low SES is associated with increased incidence of asthma and other diseases, and that compound exposure to wildfire smoke. Individuals with low SES may oftentimes have more challenging access to resources, and that could be used to, say, minimize their exposure in the event of a wildfire. For example, just access to air conditioning and air filtering to reduce particle pollution. I'm thinking particularly about people who live outside during the summers and who could be potentially affected by smoke and not have a place to take refuge. So I want to touch a little bit on public and personal air shelters. So air quality events resulting from wildfires obviously represent an emerging public health concern from our standpoint, and that really hasn't been recognized until recently. And as such, guidelines to ensure that shelters can meet certain air quality standards are needed. And so, we've looked around for what exists in terms of guidelines. The Oregon Health Authority actually has come up with some really interesting information about this and created some lists of considerations for dedicated public clean air shelters. And in this process of kind of thinking through this, we've identified 3 kinds of shelters, comprised both of public and personal spaces. And so just want to kind of list them here quickly, just kind of lay out sort of some of the thinking about public and personal private air spaces. So you could have a dedicated air shelter. And these are ideas in larger cities, but the OES, our Office of Emergency Services, along with the American Red Cross, actually has listed about 20 potential emergency shelters in our area that can be utilized in case of need. So when we did the facility survey, about 8 of those 20s we did survey. We managed to get survey results, and we found that they, with regards to air quality, they weren't that different from a lot of other buildings in our area, which leads to think that, because, there's many criteria for emergency shelters, but air quality hasn't necessarily been a consideration. So, just one of these possible places, it would be dedicated air shelters, and we certainly need to think about air quality as was one of the factors in considering what spaces we would use. Another approach to public air spaces is the use of public spaces like commercial venues, theaters, gyms, places of worship, community centers, and other places where people just naturally gather. In our facility survey, we tried to broadly survey the buildings that people use in our community, and found that they vary quite a bit in terms of their ability to mitigate and deal with poor air quality events. And then lastly, the third one I want to mention is just the concept of a personal air shelter. Individual solutions to create a cleaner air environment. So that could be a room in your house that you can seal off tightly, that you could put an air conditioner in because, to keep the air cool enough to be comfortable, and some sort of air scrubber that could circulate the air and make sure that smoke from the outside was getting regularly cleaned. So in our mind, it's really important to consider both public options and personal solutions, because not everyone may be able to provide a personal solution, although it would be ideal in many aspects. So we are just trying to explore what public air shelters could look like. And of course, an alternative to the public cleaner air shelter is what I mentioned before, just some place that would provide temporary respite when air quality is poor outside. Um, so key to the questions needed to be answered in order to evaluate these options include, what would be required to ensure good air quality in places, and I'm talking about public spaces now, in places proximate to where people live, as perhaps satellite cleaner air spaces. And currently, there's no comprehensive list of local venues, like places of worship or clubhouses or commercial spaces or nearby buildings that could serve as cleaner air spaces. And additionally, there's no systematic effort to determine the interior air quality of buildings, as that slide I showed you indicated. Some service providers that we've spoken with have indicated the need for a central hub to meet the needs of their populations, including youth and seniors, as well as housing services for people who are homeless. And so, one question that comes up is, can various populations be accommodated using shared facilities, or are multiple solutions needed? And then, of course, the coronavirus presents some new dimensions on how public health mediates public gatherings and the use of buildings. The pandemic creates some challenges and brings to the fore the need to address public health issues in a coordinated manner. And the dialogue will likely inform cleaner air strategies as we move forward. So the last thing I want to do is just kind of give you a brief idea of some of the recommendations that we came up with as a result of this discovery process. So just stepping back a bit, obviously addressing landscape treatments for our region is key to preventing and controlling wildfires. But it is highly probable that fires will continue in California. California is a fire-adapted area, and fire is a reality. And there are some amazing efforts being made right now in this area already in terms of forest management, landscape treatment. You guys are probably familiar with them. To protect residents from the ancillary impacts of wildfire, like smoke, we must understand better how individual health outcomes are impacted by the air quality around us. And so the following recommendations for next steps include these. Better public health data. We need some high resolution health-related data to do an in-depth analysis of climate change impacts on society and disadvantaged communities in particular. And data that would compare air quality and health outcomes of sensitive populations during poor air quality days would be great. And we could perhaps do this, say, using emergency room visits to local hospitals. It could be a simple approach to understand the health impacts of wildfire smoke in this area. The second recommendation is more and better air quality monitoring. The ability to monitor air quality inside of public and private spaces would be useful for all of us to make informed decisions about where and how to find and or create cleaner air spaces as needed. And there are some important buildings like schools that are not adequately understood in terms of air quality. So more study is required to prepare schools to respond adequately to bad air quality events. Again, more in-depth and more widely done facilities assessments. Future efforts to do this in the Sierra will need to have greater representation, more buildings, and particularly schools and emergency shelters. There's also, these are crucial infrastructure for resiliency of our communities, and they aren't that well represented in the survey we did. So part of that was because we started the survey, or we were doing the survey just as COVID hit, and it kind of reprioritized a lot of people's efforts. But an update of these surveys would be really good, and we will continue to do this and include other components in future efforts to target different facility types and more of them. And then lastly, just our understanding of vulnerable populations. We do need more information to ascertain the specific needs of the vulnerable populations in our county and this area broadly. But we're going to be doing additional interviews with community service providers and we expect that we can get some valuable information from them, as well as their recommendations as well. So in conclusion, really some long-range planning is required to address air quality going forward. And smoke from wildfires is becoming a regular occurrence in our state and region as the frequency and severity of wildfires increases as a result of climate change and forest management and all the things that we understand about the causes of wildfire in the state. And this demands improved capabilities to assess and navigate poor air quality, as well as all the other aspects of wildfire. So when regional wildfire events occur, we need to be able to educate the public how to respond as well as possible, and particularly focus on among vulnerable populations is extra important. So community efforts to connect environmental health and personal health are important to ensure that counties in the Sierra foothills continue to be a desirable, healthy place to live. And addressing the impacts of climate change require a focus on concrete problems such as forest health and also the possibility of wildfire. Like I said, there's amazing efforts already being undertaken in that area. And so as we go forward in all of this, the abilities of residents in our area and agencies to think systematically and take actions to create resilient fire-adapted communities in the Sierra will shape how we live and thrive in the foothills, and the air quality is part of that. So it's interesting. I mean, we share this area, and smoke is an interesting thing. It's kind of a proxy for that shared environment we care about and are working on to make better. So with that, I conclude my talk, and I just want to say thank you briefly to the funders that help make our work possible, particularly on this project. It's the Sierra Health Foundation, the Heller Foundation, and the California EPA. And lastly, this is part of our Lunch and Learn series. We've been doing it since mid-May. We're concluding it. Next week, our last presentation will be done by Izzy Martin, our CEO. She's going to talk about the Sierra Fund's advocacy in the capital for our area. And all of these were recorded, as is today's. They are or will be posted on our website. And there were some really great presentations on a whole bunch of work that the Sierra Fund does. So it's a really good way to get a fast, clear, concise idea of what kind of work we're doing. So I encourage you all to go onto our website, look up the Lunch and Learn series, and see if there's anything that interests you. And so with that, I want to say thank you again, and I want to open it up for questions. Stop the screen share and contact us. We love to talk to everybody, and we probably do already. I'm sure many of you are people we're working with, I hope. And so my email is here. So is Alex Keeple-Toll. She was also working on this cleaner air strategy. And yeah, let's be in touch. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I will stop this screen share and open it up.